January 20th, 1953, 11:57 in the morning, Harry Truman sat in the back seat of a black limousine outside the White House, watching the new president-elect arrived to pick him up for the ride to the Capitol. Dwight Eisenhower was already in the car. He had refused to come inside, refused the invitation for coffee, refused even to step foot in the White House until he could enter it as president. The Eisenhowers waited in their vehicle until Truman came outside. CBS correspondent Eric Seid watched the scene unfold. He would later write that it was a shocking moment. The ride to the Capitol that morning took 17 minutes. Neither man spoke much. The tension between them was so thick that one aide described it as hatred like a monsoon. 10 years earlier, these two men had been friends. Now they could barely stand to be in the same car. What happened in that car ride would begin an 8-year period during which Harry Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, refused to set foot in the White House. Not once, not for 8 years. Not until a new president invited him back. This is the story of how the friendship between two of America's most powerful men shattered completely, and why one of them stayed away from the White House for nearly a decade. The first time Harry Truman saw Dwight Eisenhower was in June 1945. The war in Europe had just ended. Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander, the man who had planned D-Day, the architect of Nazi Germany's defeat. He was the most famous general in America. Newspapers called him the liberator of Europe. Crowds gathered by the thousands wherever he went. In London, in Paris, in Brussels, people lined the streets to cheer him. He was more than a general. He was a symbol of American power and Allied victory. Truman had been president for less than 2 months. Franklin Roosevelt had died in April, and Truman, the vice president, had suddenly found himself leading a nation still at war. He had never wanted to be president. He had told friends that when Roosevelt died, he felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on him. Truman had been a farmer, a failed haberdasher, a county judge, and a senator. He had never commanded an army. He had never negotiated with Churchill or Stalin. He had never made decisions that affected millions of lives. Now, suddenly, he was making all of those decisions. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark. Eisenhower was born in Texas and raised in Kansas in a modest home where his parents followed a strict religious faith. He had attended West Point and spent his entire adult life in the military. He understood hierarchy, discipline, and chain of command. He had risen through the ranks by being competent, reliable, and politically astute. He knew how to work with difficult personalities. He knew how to navigate complex organizational structures. He was 54 years old and at the peak of his career, showing clear confidence and strong leadership. Truman was born in Missouri and had never attended college. His family could not afford it. He had worked on his family's farm, tried and failed to make money in various business ventures, and eventually found his calling in local politics. He was blunt, direct, and sometimes profane. He made decisions quickly and stuck with them. He valued loyalty above almost everything else. He was 60 years old and had never expected to be president. But Truman understood power when he saw it. Eisenhower was a hero. The American people loved him. Soldiers loved him. Foreign leaders respected him. Truman knew that whoever controlled Eisenhower's loyalty would have significant political influence. Truman also knew that Eisenhower was being courted by both political parties. The Republicans wanted him to run for president in 1948. Some Democrats wanted the same thing. Eisenhower had never publicly stated which party he belonged to. He was politically valuable precisely because he seemed to be above politics. In July 1945, Truman traveled to Germany to meet with Stalin and Churchill at Potsdam. Truman saw Eisenhower as a hero and began cultivating a relationship with him. Over the next 2 years, their friendship deepened. Truman believed Eisenhower could unite the country. He believed Eisenhower had the qualities of a great leader. In July 1947, Truman made an extraordinary offer. He told Eisenhower that if General Douglas MacArthur ran for president as a Republican in 1948, Eisenhower should run for president on the Democratic ticket. Truman said he would be glad to serve as vice president. It was an astonishing proposal. A sitting president offering to become vice president for a general who had never held elected office, Eisenhower politely declined. He said he had no interest in politics. He was a soldier, not a politician. But Truman kept trying. In November 1945, Truman appointed Eisenhower to replace George Marshall as Army Chief of Staff. Eisenhower directed the demobilization of the wartime army and worked to unify the armed services. In February 1948, Truman awarded Eisenhower his 4th Distinguished Service Medal. They were photographed together, both smiling. The relationship was warm, friendly, mutually respectful. Eisenhower left active duty in May 1948 and became president of Columbia University in New York. Truman won an upset victory that year without Eisenhower's help, but their friendship continued. They corresponded regularly. Truman kept Eisenhower informed about foreign policy decisions. In 1950, when Truman needed someone to command the new North Atlantic Treaty Organization forces in Europe, he called Eisenhower. Eisenhower agreed and flew to Paris in early 1951 to take command. The correspondence between them during this period was warm and respectful. Eisenhower addressed Truman as Mr. President. Truman called him Ike. They exchanged views on Soviet intentions, European defense, and military strategy. There was no hint of the catastrophe that was coming. The break began during the 1952 presidential campaign. Truman had decided not to run for re-election. This whole part shows two men growing closer before everything changed suddenly and painfully. He was exhausted, unpopular because of the Korean War, and ready to go home to Missouri. The Democratic Party nominated Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois. The Republicans needed a candidate who could win. Senator Robert Taft was the conservative favorite, but he was an isolationist who opposed NATO. The moderate wing of the Republican Party wanted Eisenhower. Eisenhower resisted at first. He told friends he had no desire to enter politics, but pressure mounted Eisenhower for president rallies drew enormous crowds. In February 1952, a rally at Madison Square Garden attracted 40,000 people chanting his name, Eisenhower, to watch a film of the rally at his home near Paris. It was an emotional moment. He realized the American people wanted him to run. In June 1952, Eisenhower returned to the United States and announced his candidacy. He went to his hometown of Abine, Kansas, to make the announcement. The race was on. Truman did not campaign at first. He thought Stevenson, an intellectual and a gifted speaker, would win on his own merits. But as the campaign progressed, Truman grew increasingly angry at the Republican attacks on his administration. The Republicans accused him of being soft on communism. They blamed him for losing China. They attacked his conduct of the Korean War. And Eisenhower, Truman's friend, said nothing to defend him. Then came the Wisconsin speech. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin had been attacking government officials as communist sympathizers for 2 years. McCarthy's accusations had ruined careers and destroyed reputations. He operated by innuendo and half-truths. He would make wild accusations without evidence and then challenge his targets to prove their innocence. It was impossible to disprove a negative. McCarthy thrived on the paranoia of the early Cold War. Soviet spies had been discovered in the government. The Soviets had developed atomic weapons years ahead of schedule. Communist forces had taken over China. Americans were frightened, and McCarthy exploited that fear ruthlessly. One of his targets was George Marshall, Truman's former Secretary of State and the architect of the Marshall Plan. Marshall was also Eisenhower's mentor. Marshall had promoted Eisenhower over dozens of more senior generals during World War II. In 1942, when the Army needed someone to command American forces in Europe, Marshall had recommended Eisenhower. Marshall himself had wanted that command desperately. He had spent his entire career preparing for it. But President Roosevelt insisted that Marshall was too valuable in Washington as Chief of Staff. Marshall accepted that decision without complaint and recommended Eisenhower instead. It was an act of selflessness that Eisenhower never forgot. Marshall had given Eisenhower the opportunity of a lifetime. Eisenhower owed his entire career to Marshall. McCarthy called Marshall a liar, a man steeped in falsehood. He accused Marshall of being soft on communism. He suggested that Marshall had deliberately sabotaged American interests in China, which made the claims feel even more unfair and shocking to many people. He implied that Marshall was part of a conspiracy to help the Soviets. It was a vicious, unfair attack on one of America's greatest public servants. Marshall had served his country with distinction for more than 40 years. He had been Chief of Staff during World War II. He had been Secretary of State. He had created the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after the war and prevented Soviet expansion. He was admired around the world. But McCarthy did not care. Marshall was a Democrat who had served in the Truman administration. That made him a target. In October 1952, Eisenhower was scheduled to give a campaign speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. Eisenhower prepared a speech that included 74 words defending Marshall. He planned to deliver it with McCarthy sitting on stage beside him. It would be a direct repudiation of McCarthy in his own state. The passage read in part that Marshall was a man and a soldier. A great patriot, Eisenhower wanted to make it clear that he stood with Marshall, not with McCarthy. But on the afternoon before the speech, Republican leaders in Wisconsin met with Eisenhower. The governor was there. State party officials were there. They were worried. Wisconsin was a crucial swing state. McCarthy was enormously popular in Wisconsin. His approval ratings in his home state were sky high. If Eisenhower attacked McCarthy, they might lose Wisconsin's electoral votes. And without Wisconsin, the election could be in jeopardy. They pressured Eisenhower to remove the defense of Marshall from his speech. They told him it would be political suicide to antagonize McCarthy in Wisconsin. Eisenhower, an inexperienced politician who had never run for office before, gave in. He agreed to delete the 74 words. That evening, he delivered the speech without mentioning Marshall at all. He stood on stage with McCarthy beside him. He praised McCarthy's goals, even while suggesting that methods were sometimes excessive. But he did not defend Marshall. He did not challenge McCarthy's accusations. He even shook hands with McCarthy for the cameras afterward, both men smiling for the photographers. There was one problem. The original text of the speech had already been given to reporters. Campaign press aide Fred Seaton had mentioned to New York Times reporter William Lawrence that the speech would include praise for Marshall. Lawrence had written about it. So when Eisenhower failed to defend Marshall, it became front-page news. The headline in one Milwaukee paper read, "Election at any cost." The New York Times ran a story about the deleted passage. The famous political cartoonist Herb Bloch drew a cartoon titled "Anything to Win," showing Eisenhower as willing to do anything for political advantage. The public reaction was brutal. Many people, including Republicans, felt that Eisenhower had betrayed his principles for political advantage. Some newspapers that had been supporting Eisenhower questioned whether he had the moral courage to be president. Truman was furious, feeling deeply hurt and shocked by what his old friend had done. Marshall had been his friend, and his Secretary of State, Marshall, was one of the few men Truman considered truly great. And I want to say, in simple words, that Truman had seen Marshall work tirelessly during the war. And he had seen Marshall rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan. And he had seen Marshall negotiate with Stalin, Churchill, and de Gaulle. Marshall had served his country with complete dedication and without a hint of self-interest. To see Eisenhower abandon Marshall under pressure from McCarthy was, in Truman's view, unforgivable. Truman said publicly, "I had never thought the man who is now the Republican candidate would stoop so low. From that moment, the friendship was over. The man Truman had once offered to help become president was now in his eyes a moral coward." But Truman did not stop there, because he felt deeply hurt and angry. He began campaigning actively for Stevenson. He traveled across the country, giving speeches, and in those speeches he attacked Eisenhower personally and viciously. The attacks went far beyond normal political rhetoric. They were personal, cutting designed to wound. He accused Eisenhower of having abandoned his principles. He said Eisenhower had displayed moral blindness by refusing to defend Marshall. He called Eisenhower ignorant of how government worked. He said that Eisenhower, who had spent his entire life taking orders and giving orders in the military, had no understanding of how a democracy functioned. He mocked Eisenhower's lack of a political experience at one campaign stop. Truman predicted that Eisenhower would struggle with the complexities of civilian leadership. He said Eisenhower would find the presidency frustrating because Congress would not follow orders. Like soldiers did, the crowd responded to these attacks and the newspapers reported them. Eisenhower heard about everyone in another speech. Truman accused Eisenhower of surrounding himself with yes-men who would not dare to disagree with the general. He said Eisenhower had no experience working with Congress, no understanding of the budget process, no knowledge of domestic policy. He suggested that Eisenhower was being manipulated by conservative Republicans who would use him as a figurehead while they dismantled the New Deal programs that had helped Americans for 20 years. These attacks were personal and cutting. Eisenhower took them very hard, according to MTT John Hughes. One of Eisenhower's speechwriters, the mere mention of Harry Truman's name brought fast flashes of antipathy in the candidate. Eisenhower felt betrayed. He had served his country honorably for 40 years. He had commanded millions of troops. He had planned the largest military operation in history. He had helped defeat Nazi Germany and now the president. A man he had considered a friend was calling him ignorant and morally blind. Eisenhower told aides that Truman's attacks were beneath the dignity of the presidency. He said, Truman was acting like a partisan hack rather than a statesman. The bitterness ran deep on both sides. Every attack from Truman made Eisenhower angrier every day of the campaign, widened the gap between them on November 4, 1952. Eisenhower won the election in a landslide, and people everywhere watched the moment closely. He carried 39 states. The Electoral College vote was 400, 42 to 89. It was a crushing defeat for the Democratic Party, and it was clear to many people that Truman's attacks had not worked. And if anything, they may have made things worse by making Truman look bitter and partisan after the election. Truman invited Eisenhower to the White House for a transition meeting. It was scheduled for November 18th. Protocol required it. The outgoing president always briefed the incoming president on the major issues facing the country. Eisenhower agreed to attend, but he did not want to go, and he told aides he dreaded the meeting. The meeting took place in the Oval Office. Truman tried to provide advice. He briefed Eisenhower on the organization of the White House staff. He discussed foreign policy issues, including the ongoing Korean War and relations with the Soviet Union. He offered suggestions on how to work with Congress. Eisenhower sat politely and listened. But later he wrote in his diary that the meeting added little to his knowledge and did not affect his planning for the new administration. In other words, he thought it was a waste of time. After the meeting, Truman invited Eisenhower to return for a pre-Christmas lunch at the White House. Eisenhower declined. He saw no reason to spend more time with Truman than absolutely necessary. The transition was cold and formal. Most transitions involve regular contact between the outgoing and incoming presidents. This one did not. Eisenhower and Truman met only once between the election and Inauguration Day. That single meeting was stiff, formal, embarrassing, and unrewarding. Then came Inauguration Day itself, January 20th, 1953. The temperature was 30 degrees. The sky was overcast. Eisenhower had decided without consulting Truman to wear a Hamburg hat instead of the traditional silk top hat. It was a small thing, but it annoyed Truman. It felt like one more slight, one more sign that Eisenhower did not respect the office or the traditions. When the Eisenhowers arrived at the White House that morning to pick up the Trumans for the drive to the Capitol, they refused to come inside. Best, Truman had invited my Eisenhower in for coffee. The Eisenhowers stayed in their car. Truman finally came outside. He climbed into the back seat of the limousine. Eisenhower was already seated. They sat side by side for the 17-minute drive to the Capitol. Photographers captured images of them sitting together, both with forced smiles that barely hid their mutual resentment during the drive. There was little conversation at one point. Eisenhower asked Truman who had ordered his son John, who was serving in Korea, to return to the United States for the inauguration. Truman said he had given the order. He thought it was right and proper for a son to witness his father being sworn in as President Eisenhower. Thanked him. That was the extent of their meaningful interaction. They arrived at the Capitol. Chief Justice Fred Vincent administered the oath of office. Eisenhower delivered his inaugural address. He spoke about America's responsibility as leader of the free world. He promised to confront the challenges facing the Procel nation. The inaugural parade that followed was 10 miles long and included marching bands, along with many bright cheering groups, floats showing scenes from Eisenhower's life, and even a television cowboy who lassoed the president with permission from the Secret Service after the ceremony. Truman and Bess returned to Missouri. They took a train from Washington's Union Station. A crowd gathered to see them off. Truman waved from the back of the train as it pulled away. He was going home. After 8 years in the White House, he would not return for a very long time. In the months and years that followed, the arrangement between Truman and Eisenhower deepened. Eisenhower never invited Truman to the White House, not for state dinners, not for consultations, not for ceremonial occasions. When foreign leaders visited, Truman was not invited to meet them. When important legislation was signed, Truman was not there when the White House held receptions for important occasions. Truman's name was not on the guest list. The regular correspondence between them stopped almost entirely. A few weeks after taking office, Eisenhower wrote, "Truman, a brief thank you note for returning a globe that Truman had borrowed, that was it. One note in 8 years for more than 5 years. From January 1953 until May 1958. Eisenhower extended no invitations to Truman, no phone calls, no letters, no contact. Truman noticed. He noticed every time Eisenhower hosted a ceremony at the White House and did not invite him. He noticed when Eisenhower met with Churchill and did not consult him. He noticed when Eisenhower traveled to Europe and did not ask for his advice on dealing with European leaders. Truman had met with all of those leaders. He knew them personally. He had negotiated with them, but Eisenhower did not want his help. Truman felt shut out, ignored, disrespected. He was still alive. He was still capable. He had knowledge and experience that could have been valuable. But Eisenhower wanted nothing to do with him. Truman tried to reach out at least once in 1953 when Eisenhower visited Kansas City. Truman called the hotel where Eisenhower was staying. He wanted to pay his respects, according to Truman. Whoever answered the phone said the president was too busy to see him. Truman claimed he was told that the president's schedule was completely full. There was no time for a meeting. Eisenhower later claimed he never received the call. He said he asked his staff to determine whether Truman had actually called. He said he could not find anyone who remembered taking such a call. It is unclear what really happened. Did someone on Eisenhower's staff deliberately block the call? Did they simply forget to tell Eisenhower that Truman had called? Or did Truman misremember the incident? We will never know. What is clear is that the meeting never happened. The two men lived in different worlds now, separated by bitterness and wounded pride. In his private letters to friends, Truman expressed his anger in language he would never use publicly. He wrote to Dean Acheson, who had served as his Secretary of State and remained one of his closest confidants in those letters. Truman called Eisenhower Alibi Ike. The nickname was cutting it. Suggested that Eisenhower always had an excuse, always had someone else to blame. Never took responsibility. Truman said Eisenhower did not know the first thing about running a government. He said Eisenhower was lazy, that he spent more time playing golf than working. He said Eisenhower's foreign policy was weak and confused. He criticized Eisenhower's handling of civil rights, his approach to the Soviet Union, his relationship with Congress. Nothing Eisenhower did was right in Truman's eyes. In July 1957, Truman began planning ways to show his disapproval more clearly to friends and the public. Dedicated his presidential library in Independence, Missouri. It was a major event. Presidential libraries are important institutions. They house the papers and documents of a president's time in office. They serve as research centers for historians and museums for the public. The dedication of a presidential library is typically attended by the sitting president. It is a gesture of respect for the office and for the continuity of American democracy. Eisenhower did not attend. He sent a tour message that the administrator of the General Services Administration read. During the ceremony, the message was formal and impersonal. Truman was insulted. He wrote sarcastically to Dean Acheson, his former Secretary of State. "I hope you were impressed with Ike's telegram to the people. What in hell makes some of us tick?" Truman used far more colourful language in private. According to biographer David McCullough, Truman could hardly refer to Eisenhower without using profanity. He called him Alibi Ike. He said, Eisenhower did not know the first thing about running a government. He mocked Eisenhower's foreign policy decisions. He criticised Eisenhower's handling of the F-2 economy. The anger never faded inside the Eisenhower White House. Almost no one talked about Truman. It was as if the previous administration had never existed. Eisenhower's aides knew better than to mention Truman's name in the president's presence. The bitterness was too deep. But there was one man in the Eisenhower administration who thought the situation was wrong. His name was Bryce Harlow. Harlow served as administrative assistant to the president, special assistant to the president, and deputy assistant to the president. For congressional affairs, he had worked in government since the 1940s. He had served in the Truman administration before joining Eisenhower's team. He knew both men. He respected both men, and he believed the arrangement between them was bad for the country. In May 1958, Harlow decided to do something about it. It was a risky move. Eisenhower's feelings about Truman were well known. Bringing up the subject could cost Harlow his job, but Harlow believed it was the right thing to do. Harlow approached senior staff members seeking support. Chief of Staff Sherman Adams, Jerry Persons, Thomas Stevens, and James Haggerty all refused to help Adams, even asked if Harlow had lost his mind. Only Ann Whitman, Eisenhower's secretary, agreed to leave the Oval Office door open in case Harlow needed to rush back out one day. Harlow walked into the Oval Office and raised the subject with Eisenhower. He said that the public estrangement between a sitting president and a former president was damaging to the office of the presidency. He said it sent the wrong message to the American people and to the world. He said that regardless of their personal feelings, Eisenhower and Truman needed to make peace. Eisenhower listened. His reaction was emotional. He was angry at first, the wounds were still too fresh. But Harlow persisted and carefully explained why the reconciliation was very important for the country and history. He said that inviting Truman would help Eisenhower feel better for the rest of his life, no matter if Truman accepted or not. Finally, after a hard conversation, Eisenhower agreed to send the invitations. Between May 1958 and May 1959, Eisenhower sent 3 invitations to Truman. The first, dated May 20th, 1958, invited Truman to the dedication of the Korean War unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery on May 30th, 1959, giving only 11 days' notice. Truman said no because he had plans to travel to Europe. The second invitation, dated January 30th, 1959, invited Truman to a NATO foreign ministers meeting in early April, giving 2 months' notice. Truman said no again. The third invitation, dated April 30th, 1959, invited Truman to a White House stag dinner honouring Winston Churchill on May 6th. Only 7 days' notice, Truman said no again, saying he had to be in New York. Truman was hurt because he thought 2 of the 3 invitations had been on purpose with short notice. He thought there were political reasons behind it. He wrote to Dean Acheson that he believed the invitations were sent late on purpose. Eisenhower, on his side, felt he had tried 3 invitations, 3 rejections. The gap between them stayed. Later that year, in October 1959, George Marshall died. Marshall was 88 years old. His death brought together many men who had worked with him during World War II and the early Cold War. The funeral was held at Fort Myer Chapel in Virginia. Eisenhower went, and so did Truman. They sat side by side in the first pew during the 20-minute service. It was the first time they were in the same room since Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1953. Almost 7 years had passed. The funeral was sad. 200 guests came to the Episcopal service. Eisenhower and Truman did not talk much. Only a short exchange of condolences as they sat together, but they were in the same place at the same time, honouring the man who had mentored both of them. It was a start, even if small. After the funeral, they went their separate ways. The estrangement continued, but something had changed. The worst of the anger seemed to be gone. In November 1960, the American people chose a new president. John Kennedy, a young senator from Massachusetts, beat Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president. Kennedy was 43 years old, the youngest person ever elected president. He was handsome, charming, and spoke well. He was from a new generation. He was born in the 20th century. He had fought in World War II as a young naval officer. He had no memory of the Great Depression or the world before the war. To many Americans, he seemed like the future. Truman had not supported Kennedy during the Democratic primaries. He thought Kennedy was too young and too inexperienced. At the Democratic convention, Truman had publicly shared his worries. He said he was deeply worried about the situation America faced in the world. He said he hoped someone with the greatest possible maturity and experience would be available. This was a hidden criticism of Kennedy. Truman liked Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri, an older man with more government experience, but Kennedy got the nomination anyway. The delegates at the convention chose youth and energy instead of experience and caution. But after Kennedy won the nomination, Truman worked for him with full energy. He traveled across the country, giving speeches to help Kennedy. He attacked Nixon with the same energy he had once used against Eisenhower. At 76 years old, Truman threw himself into the campaign just like he had in 1948. He went to 9 states. He spoke at rallies. He met with local Democratic leaders. He did everything Kennedy's campaign asked him to do. Truman was a loyal Democrat. Once the party chose its nominee, Truman fully supported that person. Kennedy appreciated it. He knew Truman's support, especially in the Midwest, had helped him win important states. Missouri, Kansas, Illinois, all states where Truman was still respected and had influence, voted for Kennedy. The margin was very small. Kennedy won the popular vote by only about 100,000 votes out of almost 69 million cast. Without Truman's help in the Midwest, Kennedy might have lost. After the election, Kennedy wanted to honor Truman in an important way. He made Truman the first official guest at the White House after the inauguration. Not a foreign leader, not a member of Congress, not a big donor, not a Labor leader, not a civil rights leader, Harry Truman. The man who had been left out of the White House for 8 years would be the first person Kennedy welcomed as president. The invitation was sent. This time, Truman said yes right away. No hesitation, no excuses, no other plans. He wanted to go. He wanted to see the White House again. He wanted to walk through the rooms he had lived in for 8 years. On January 21st, 1961, the day after Kennedy's inauguration, Harry and Bess Truman returned to the White House. They brought their daughter Margaret with them. It had been 8 years since they left. Truman was 76 years old. His hair was all white now. He moved a little slower than before, but his mind was sharp and his opinions strong as ever. They arrived in the morning at 10:02. The White House looked the same from the outside, same white columns, same portico, same iron fence. But when Truman went inside, he noticed changes right away. The furniture was new, the decorations were different, the paintings on the walls had changed. The Kennedys had added their own style. It looked younger, more modern, more artistic. Jackie Kennedy had taste and ideas. She was already planning to restore the White House and fill it with American antiques and art, but the structure of the house was the same. The layout felt familiar. Truman knew every room, every hallway, every staircase. Kennedy gave Truman a tour of the White House. They walked through the West Wing, past the offices where Truman had worked every day for 8 years. They went to the Oval Office. Truman stood in the doorway and looked at the desk where he had signed laws, read intelligence reports, made decisions about war and peace. Kennedy asked. Kennedy asked Truman about his time as president. He asked about specific decisions. How did you decide to use atomic weapons against Japan? How did you deal with Stalin? What was it like to fire Douglas MacArthur? What advice would you give to a new president? Truman answered every question honestly. He told Kennedy that being president was the loneliest job in the world. He said that no matter how many advisors you have, the final decision is always yours alone. He said that you have to make choices based on the best information you have and then live with the results. He said that you cannot make everyone happy and you should not try. He said, you have to do what you think is right and accept that half the country will be angry with you for it. Kennedy listened carefully. He took notes. He asked follow-up questions. Truman was happy. Here was a young president who really wanted his advice, who valued his experience, who respected what he had done. It was very different from Eisenhower. Eisenhower had never asked for his advice. Eisenhower had completely shut him out. But Kennedy was different. Kennedy saw that Truman's experience mattered. Kennedy understood that Truman had faced similar problems and had useful knowledge to share. Truman visited the White House many more times during Kennedy's presidency. He was welcomed warmly each time. Later in 1961, at a formal dinner, Truman sat at the piano in the East Room and played for all the guests. He played classical music and popular songs. His fingers moved confidently over the keys. He had been playing piano since he was a child. It was one of his favorite pleasures. Photos from that evening showed Truman smiling widely, clearly happy to be back in the White House. His smile was real. The anger and bitterness that had marked his relationship with Eisenhower were gone. He had finally returned. After 8 years, he was welcome again. The White House was no longer closed to him. It felt like coming home. In the years that followed, Truman and Kennedy built a warm relationship. Kennedy called Truman often for advice. He invited Truman to important events. When Kennedy signed the Medicare law in 1965, he went to the Truman Library in Independence to do it. He wanted Truman there because Truman had first suggested national health insurance in the 1940s. It was a sign of respect and recognition. Truman was deeply moved, but Eisenhower and Truman stayed apart. Even after Eisenhower left office in January 1961, the two men had almost no contact. Eisenhower retired to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Truman stayed in Independence, Missouri. They were both older statesmen now, both former presidents, both members of the exclusive club of men who had held the highest office in the country. But they were not friends. They were not even polite acquaintances. Then, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was killed in Dallas. The nation went into mourning. Kennedy's funeral was in Washington on November 25th. Every living former president was expected to come. Eisenhower flew from Gettysburg. Truman came from Independence. The funeral was held at St. Matthew's Cathedral. Afterward, there was a procession to Arlington National Cemetery for the burial. Eisenhower and Truman rode together in a car, the same car from the cathedral to the cemetery. It was the first time they had been alone together since that cold morning in January 1953, when they rode to Eisenhower's inauguration. Now, more than 10 years later, they were together again, because another president had died. The car ride to Arlington took about 30 minutes. What they said to each other during that ride is not fully known. But something changed. The hatred that had divided them for more than a decade began to soften because of shared grief. After the burial, the cars returned to Blair House, where Truman was staying. Eisenhower rode with him. When they arrived at Blair House, Eisenhower did something he had never done during his 8 years as president. He accepted Truman's invitation to come inside. They went into Blair House together. They sat down and had coffee. 10 years after Eisenhower had refused to come into the White House for coffee on Inauguration Day, the two men finally sat together over coffee and sandwiches. They talked for more than an hour. The conversation was nice, even friendly. They talked about Kennedy. They talked about the state of the world. They talked about getting older. The anger was gone, not forgotten, but set aside. They were two old men now, veterans of a different time, survivors of battles, both political and personal. Photos from that day show them sitting together at Blair House. Their body language is relaxed. They are not smiling widely, but they are not glaring at each other either. They look like what they are, two former presidents brought together by sadness. The press reported that Eisenhower and Truman had finally made peace. The headline said the feud was over. To some degree, that was true. The worst of the bitterness had passed, but the relationship never fully recovered. They were never friends again. They exchanged a few letters after that day. They saw each other at a few more public events. When Eisenhower's brother Milton visited Kansas City in 1966, he met with Truman. The two brothers later talked about Truman and Eisenhower without the old anger. But the warmth that had been there in the 1940s never came back. Dwight Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969. He was 78 years old. He had been sick with heart disease for years. Truman, by then 84 and in worse health himself, did not go to the funeral. He sent his condolences to Eisenhower, but he stayed in Independence. Truman died on December 26, 1972, at age 88. He had lived 3 years longer than Eisenhower. In all those years after Kennedy's funeral, Truman never spoke warmly of Eisenhower again. He accepted that they had put aside their differences, but he never said he had been wrong to be angry. He never said he regretted the attacks he had made during the 1952 campaign. What caused this 8-year argument? Why did two men who had been friends become bitter enemies? The answer is not simple, but it comes down to pride, principle, and politics. Truman believed that Eisenhower had abandoned George Marshall, a man who deserved loyalty and defense. In Truman's view, Eisenhower had chosen political convenience over moral courage. He had given in to McCarthy instead of standing up for what was right. That was unforgivable. Eisenhower, for his part, thought Truman had attacked him unfairly during the campaign. He felt that Truman had questioned his honesty, his intelligence, and his ability to be president. Eisenhower had spent his whole adult life serving his country. To be called ignorant and morally blind by the president in office was deeply hurtful. Both men were proud. Both men felt betrayed. Neither man was willing to make the first move to reconcile, so they stayed apart. For 8 years, Harry Truman refused to visit the White House. He said no to invitations. He made excuses. He stayed away. It was a matter of principle for him. He would not go to the White House while the man who had betrayed George Marshall sat in the Oval Office. It was stubborn. It was maybe petty, but it was real. Truman meant it. The story of Truman and Eisenhower is a story about how personal relationships can shape political history. These were two of the most powerful men in the world. They had helped win World War II. They had shaped the early Cold War. They had led America through some of its hardest years, but they could not get past a personal grudge. They let pride and anger keep them apart for nearly 10 years. There is a lesson in this. Leadership is not just about policy choices or political strategy. It is also about relationships, about trust, about how people treat each other. Eisenhower's choice to remove his defense of Marshall from that speech in Wisconsin was a political decision. He thought it would help him win the election, and it did. He won by a landslide. But that decision cost him Truman's friendship. It cost him access to Truman's advice and experience. It created a public split that hurt both men. Was it worth it? Eisenhower later said he regretted that choice for the rest of his life. He called it a terrible day. His staff also called it the same way. It haunted him. But he never said sorry to Marshall's widow, Catherine Marshall, who never forgave him. He never fully explained himself to Truman. He just lived with the results. Truman, for his part, never regretted the attacks he made in the 1952 campaign. He believed he was defending his administration and his principles. But those attacks ended a friendship and made a rift that lasted years. Both men paid a price. History remembers both Truman and Eisenhower as important presidents. Truman made the choice to use atomic weapons to end World War II. He started the Marshall Plan. He created NATO. He desegregated the armed forces. He fought the Korean War. Eisenhower ended that war. He built the interstate highway system. He sent federal troops to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock. He warned about the military-industrial complex. Both men left big legacies, but their personal relationship, which had started with so much promise in 1945, ended in bitterness and separation. It took the assassination of a president to bring them back together, even if only a little. And even then, the reconciliation was not complete. The 8 years that Truman stayed away from the White House remind us that even the most powerful people are still human. They still have feelings. They still hold grudges. They still let personal problems get in the way of their duties. It is a very human story about very powerful men today. When former presidents gather for state funerals or presidential library openings, we assume they will be polite to each other. We think that no matter their political differences, they will treat each other with respect because they are all part of the same exclusive club. But respect is not automatic. It must be kept. It can be broken. The separation between Truman and Eisenhower broke it for 8 years. It took the work of men like Bryce Harlow and the tragedy of Kennedy's death to start fixing it. The story ends not with a big, happy reconciliation, but with a quiet cup of coffee at Blair House. Two old men sitting together talking about shared memories and shared losses. The anger was gone. The friendship was not fully restored, but the separation was over. Sometimes that is the best we can hope for. Not a return to what was, but an end to what should not have happened. That is how Harry Truman finally came back from his 8-year time away from the White House. If you found this story interesting, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from American political history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each story matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community stretches from coast to coast and around the world. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.